Russia is learning from Iran.
You have the weaponization of sexual violence and rape, which is also a very ISIS style.
Russian tactics in Ukraine resemble terrorist extremist strategies. Joe Biden, back then a presidential candidate, he called Saudi Arabia an outcast in international relations.
We saw the welcoming shall we say, ceremony that happened to Mr. Putin when he visited the UAE and also Saudi.
This kind of rhetoric does not actually work well in these countries.
Ukraine did a miracle, basically.
Hi, my name is Alina Hrytsenko. I'm an international relations expert, and this is Talking Substance, where we break down complex issues into simple truth. Today on the agenda, we have another very much complex issue, which is the Middle East and its cohesion and relation to the Russian-Ukrainian war. We're going to be talking to Dr. Omar Ashour, which is a professor of security and military studies at the Doha Institute and director of strategic studies at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. Dr. Ashour is based in Doha, which is why we're going to be talking online. Please check this episode, like, and do not forget to subscribe. Hello, thank you very much for your time. Welcome to Talking Substance, and let's just go down directly into our discussion. Let's start talking about the current geopolitical developments in the region, in the Middle East. I believe it is quite important, especially for our people, our audience who are a little bit out of the context and do not follow what is actually happening in the region. It is important to analyze what are the current powerful actors in the region, because from my perspective, after the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021, something sort of a vacuum of power or vacuum of influence happened in the region. So what is actually happening now? Are there any countries, actors who are fighting and competing to become a regional power and a global power, perhaps in strategically? What is your perspective on this issue?
First, thank you, Alina, for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with the Kyiv Post. Of course, with a very long history, I've been monitoring your developments and your great achievements. So it's a pleasure to be with you. And congrats for this excellent podcast as well, which is quite impactful and quite informative, actually. With respect to the region and the US, yes, it's never boring here, right? So the developments have been quite rapid, and the withdrawal specifically from Afghanistan by the US has created a series of unintended consequences, I think. Part of that, actually, I want to clarify, the US never really withdrew completely. You know, we have quite a few large bases, including one just 30 minutes from where I am now, where the US military power is actually quite apparent. But it is less and less interested in entering into large-scale military operations like the one we saw in Iraq before and in Afghanistan. And the withdrawal from Afghanistan that way, I think, had a series of unintended consequences. Among them was probably the escalation and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Partly because the US and its allies were looked at as defeated by a militia, basically by the Taliban, from Afghanistan in that way, and therefore they will not stand up for an ally. But that's another issue we can come to a bit later in our conversation. But clearly, when you're steadily withdrawing from the region, that power vacuum will be filled. It was filled by multiple actors. None of them so far are rising to the level of the US intervention and military and political clout in the region. One of them is Russia. Clearly, we saw it was quite successful in its Syria campaign in 2015. A regime was that was about to be taken over. Somehow Russia, with its ally Iran, with other non-state actors like Hezbollah, like others, managed to keep it intact, and managed as well to extend a bit of the we can call it the allies of Russia, like Iran, for example, managed to extend a bit of the influence in the region, including in places like Lebanon, like Yemen, like even Gaza, but also like Syria. So and including in Iraq, which is quite interesting because the U.S. intervened partly to topple the regime of Saddam Hussein, and then later on to build a democracy in Iraq. And that did not really work quite well, but Iraq became more and more closer to Iran in some of its policies, at least. And Iran, as we know, is some would put it as a tactical, and others would put it as a strategic ally of the Russian Federation. So that removal or withdrawal of the U.S. had a series of consequences on the Middle East, but also in Europe and elsewhere in the region.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, because it seems like from Ukraine, when you are observing what is happening in the region within the context of Russian-Ukrainian war, it seems to be so that there is Saudi Arabia who is aspiring to become a regional power and a global power, and that is one of the reasons of its motivation why they are having its neutral position and relying on its neutrality in this conflict. They still are trying to provide a platform for negotiations between the two sides. Even if we remember the Jeddah summit, the Jeddah peace talks that happened last year, considering the fact that those peace talks were happening without the Russian counterparts, it's still trying to provide a platform for negotiations. At the same time, there is United Arab Emirates who are also somehow involved in this process, who are negotiating about releasing the prisoners of war. So that was my question about exactly this. So is there any competition happening between the regional countries for regional power? And how do they, if they do, benefit Russian and Ukrainian conflict, Russian and Ukrainian war in this context? Is it helping it anyhow for these powers? Maybe it's not only Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. Maybe there are also other countries who are somehow trying to get involved and engaged in this conflict without being judged from one or the other side of being biased.
So there's a lot going on, right? And it needs a bit of history just to simplify it. So you had in 2004 the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and a series of other civil resistance campaigns, pro-democracy civil resistance campaigns that happened in Serbia in 2000, in Georgia in 2003, in Ukraine in 2004, Kyrgyzstan 2005. And later on, it happened in the region, a series of civil resistance campaign against corrupt, repressive regimes. And they were framed, rightly or wrongly, as the Arab Spring, between quotations. And that, by 2014, when the Maidan revolution, the revolution of dignity happened in Ukraine again, it was most of the Arab Spring movements were defeated. So the project for change towards democracy was defeated. Within that project, there was two rising regional powers. While you mentioned the US was withdrawing at this point, especially from Iraq under the Obama administration, and lessening its interventions, including actually its commitment to Ukraine when Crimea was invaded and then annexed later in March 2014. They had a commitment based on the Budapest Memorandum. They did not commit. That was part of the larger strategy of withdrawing back from conflicts. But when that happened in the Middle East, you had two regional powers who, one wanted change. That was mainly Qatar, wanted to see a bit of a change in the ruling models in the region. And others wanted continuity, meaning the status quo should be kept as it is, even if it has problems, it will keep stability. And that was Saudi and the UAE primarily. Those powers were rising because the traditional powers, Egypt, Iraq, Syria, had their major problems: economic, demographic, political, and security, and they were in a receding mood and in a collapsing mood. So these traditional powers, historically and contemporary, were receding, while the Gulf were rising. But the Gulf was rising with two different visions: a vision for change, primarily pro-democracy movement. The opinion and the other opinion, you have Al Jazeera here, offering two sides of the story. Whereas one was more of continuity, and within that frame, you saw this competition, but they also approached the competition with different ways. So you had Qatar. The Qatari way was more of a soft power approach of credibility, peace diplomacy, more media education, and as well as trying to maintain relationship with almost everybody. You had a different approach with the UAE, which more or less looked at stability and while projecting some military power, primarily via non-state actors at some point, as we see in cases like in Libya, in Sudan, in Yemen, and so on. So supporting some of the secessionist movements, some of the organizations that were like the Rapid Support Force in Sudan, a tribal militia turned into a military force within the armed forces, and so on. So it had a different way for what it sees as maintaining stability. But also the soft power was important. So being looked at as a credible negotiator, as someone with credible mediation skills was quite important. Qatar rose in that. It was successful multiple times. The last part of it hosted the negotiations between the United States and the Taliban, but also it hosted others. Saudi and the UAE wanted to have the same, shall we say, file, the Afghan file, because of its geostrategic and security impacts on the region. But also, when it comes to Ukraine, that's part of it. That's part of extending the power of mediation, the power of being looked at as a peace diplomacy powerhouse, and therefore, being credible. The problem with perhaps, and that's just my perspective, with the Saudis and the UAE, they were looked as too close to one side, which is the Russian side. It's not a secret that the sanction busting regime goes via exporting gold to Russia and other equipments go through the UAE. Similar situation when at some point the Saudi regime, the current de facto ruler, the crown prince, was looked at as cracking down on and violating human rights, values, and so on. The main one who was quite seen as welcoming and quite seen as supporting him was Mr. Putin, as opposed to others in the Western world. So in a way, these two sides were seen as quite close to one side of the party, although now things are changing. But also you had the Qatari side, where you had a way to look at the conflict as a smaller state that aspires for freedom and independence, like Ukraine. And this is attempted to be stopped by the larger neighbor, by the stronger neighbor, with a rhetoric that they know here quite well, and was seen here quite well as late as 2017 when Qatar was blockaded. So you had the heart going towards Ukraine, but also the mind is feeding Russia. So these are the dynamics. I don't know if I explained well, but it's quite complicated, and it's a rapidly developing situation. So As we know, always in the Middle East, these alliances can shift quite easy. But one issue there is that also this is back to your first question, is that the longest relationship remains with the US. Most of these countries have very strong ties with the US. This may change in the future, but so far it is upheld.
Yeah, it is quite complicated. I totally agree with you, but this is exactly what we do here in Talking Substance. We try to explain complicated issues as simple as possible. So going back to the topic of the United States that you mentioned, I'm interested if the U.S. perspective on the region changed with the outbreak, when the war or when the full-scale invasion outbroke. Because as far as I remember, a couple of years ago, Joe Biden, back then a presidential candidate, he called Saudi Arabia an outcast in international relations and refused to speak directly to Crown Prince and Prime Minister Mohammed bin Salman throughout the start of his term. And yet, a couple of years ago, he controversially visited Saudi Arabia. I believe there was an incident when, I guess, the Crown Prince decided not to shake hands with him, as far as I remember. That was all over the media. How has the Russian-Ukrainian war potentially altered or potentially expanded the avenues available for Saudi Arabia's foreign policy in terms with the United States?
So, in a way, the continuity is still there. So, in a way, you will have the support that was given by the U.S. To Ukraine since 2022. Well, since, depending on where you draw the line, from 2016 or from 2014, or from the actual aid from 2022. Most of the countries here endorsed it in the region. They did not try to undermine it or to do anything about it. But on the other end, the war itself, most of them want to distance themselves from the war effort. In Qatar, the focus is on humanitarian issues, on issues of peace negotiations, if that's on the agenda. The same thing with Saudi. But at the same time, you will see on the Saudi and the UAE side a bit more of support and endorsement for the leadership of the Russian Federation. We saw the welcoming shall we say, ceremony that happened to Mr. Putin when he visited the UAE and also Saudi. But at the same time, the continuity is still there. So there's no shifting towards one side very strongly, or towards the other side. Just being very, very careful and trying to, on one end, benefit from the relationship with Russia in the case of Saudi and the UAE, but at the same time being looked as credible negotiators in terms of their soft power advantages as well.
Okay, I can see now. So I guess we can move a little bit forward. The topic with the U.S. is fully covered, I think. Everything I wanted to ask you about the relationship of the Middle Eastern countries with the U.S., I got my answers. Thank you very much. So the question now here, I'm just wondering, how do the Middle Eastern countries perceive the Russian-Ukrainian war? Because, yeah, we can see clearly that those countries are, well, not sitting on the fence, but are still neutral in this conflict. But can we compare somehow the perception of the Middle Eastern countries to other regions like Asia, for example, because the Asian countries mostly, like India or China or let's say ASEAN countries, are also neutral, but they have its own motivation. We can see Latin American countries, they're also neutral. Well, we can at least officially, because from time to time we hear some some interesting, so to speak, propositions from the Latin American leaders regarding the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. Can we somehow compare the neutrality of the Middle Eastern countries to the neutrality of other regions? Because neutrality too has its own motivation.
So I wouldn't say I wouldn't describe it as neutral, to be honest. The region has, we're talking here mainly about official stances, right? So about governments and regimes, as opposed to people. You can things. I will get to people in a second, but it gets even more complicated when you look at the surveys and the opinion polls. But just at the government level. From Latin America to Southeast Asia, or to East Asia, it's still complicated. Argentina versus Brazil, two very different stances. Colombia government versus Colombian opposition, very different stances. I mean, you have a situation with Cuba that's a clear unneutral stance. But if you move further westwards to the Middle East. You have also very different stances. Morocco versus Algeria. Algeria clear communication stance in support of Russia, and Morocco apparently the T-72s that Ukraine received via a third country originated from Morocco. So you have also even in the region very different stances. Egypt, a classic case. At one point, was about to provide the tens to hundreds of thousands of 122 millimeters artillery, rocket artillery, grad ammunition to Russia, and then the phone call or the conversation between the president and his one of his commanders was intercepted, and as a result, the U.S. started putting some pressure to end this deal, which was going towards Russia just to be able to make money. So just to put it in perspective, the Egyptian government receives $1.3 billion every year for its army. So the United States trains, equips, finances the Egyptian army since 1979, basically, since the peace deal with Israel. And at the same time, they're trying to sell artillery ammunition to a strategic rival or a strategic threat now for the United States and its allies, and that artillery would land on Ukrainian heads. So this is how things are murky and complicated in that sense. But then it switches sides. It switches sides because they were exposed, right? So the intelligence did the job, and they were exposed. And then you move a bit even further west, and you find the dynamics that I just explained with the Doha Forum here in 2022 was just Ukraine. You know, well, the Ukraine was on every single panel. And then in 2023 things change because again, the dynamics of the region shift very fast and in very different directions. Hamas did its attack on Israel. Israel invaded Gaza. You had a completely shifting dynamics, and this is one way also to perceive how coming to the people of the region where Ukraine, where do they stand on Ukraine? People here and governments in the Middle East identify with issues like understand what is occupation, understand what is forced deportation, understand what is colonial settlers and colonial settlements like the 500,000 we see in Crimea and elsewhere in the Donbass. And they understand what is colonialism and history of colonialism, what is war of liberation. What is war of liberation when your commanders of the war of liberation are speaking the language of their colonizers. So, you know, the entire, this is the Russian language. So, you know, the entire command of Algeria's war of the independence were French speakers. They never saw themselves as French, but they were French speakers and they were communicating in French. And some of them had to learn Arabic when they went to Egypt. And So they understand these dynamics quite well on one end, but also they don't like double standards because they see the double standard all the time. So in that way, this is how sometimes Ukraine is perceived through the Palestinian, for the Arabs in the region, for the Arabs in the Middle East. Ukraine, many of them can see Ukraine through a Palestinian lens, and that needs to be also taken into account. But also with the governments, they see, especially the smaller state, the governments of the smaller states, Kuwait, Qatar, others, would see also Ukraine in a lens of a small state, of a smaller state. So Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe after Russia, but it is relatively smaller than Russia, and Russia is the aggressor here. So Kuwait, for example, has a very similar history. Larger neighbor, Iraq under Saddam, quite aggressive, almost swallowed the country. Except for an international coalition led by the US that liberated the country after being swallowed, actually. Qatar, similar situation. Two very large and strong neighbors, Saudi on one end, Iran on the other. And they perceive the war in Ukraine as, if Ukraine, God forbids, lost, with all this NATO backing, with all the European countries behind, with over 50 countries in the Rammstein Friends of Ukraine group supporting, then they are in real trouble. They are in real trouble. If it lost conventionally, but by conventional force, by mass, because that's the way you're losing by mass. You're killing of the enemy more than they kill of you. What we call the loss exchange ratio was at one point was 7-1 in Bakhmut. You still lost Bakhmut, so you're losing not because you're fighting more effectively, but the size of the force that is attacking you is a lot bigger, and therefore they can withstand this type of attrition. You can kill 5 of them, and they kill 1 of you, and they will take the 5 and bring more, and you can't replace them. So if this is very scary for smaller states, because then you know they're in trouble. When Ukraine wins, not if, when Ukraine wins and when it becomes victorious, I think they will all be back to hybrid, because hybrid was a less costly way of warfare. But this is a perspective of smaller state, which is also a lens that is Ukraine is looked at. And the final lens that both people and governments would look at here is the authoritarian versus democracy lens. They would see, but this needs a bit more media, a bit more education, because they don't know much about what happened in Ukraine between 1991 and now, and even before 1991. The dynamics of that Ukraine did a miracle, basically. Did strides in transition of its civil relations and civil military relations. That is quite unique and can serve as a model for many of the countries here. And I'm to be very frank, Ukraine did not have a very it had a complex history between its interreligious relations, especially with Jewish populations and Muslim populations, and intra-dynamics. It had some issues with regional issues, linguistic issues, and somehow that was overcame. That was overcame with a 70%, over 70% elected president from Jewish origins, currently a Muslim defense minister from Crimea, from the region that is occupied by the Russian Federation, and it made major movements or major achievements and positive changes in that regard. And this is a lens that is looked at that this is more of a democratic model that can defend itself militarily, because if you put a model of freedom and democracy on one end, but also can protect itself as opposed to collapses, this is a lens that will be looked at in a very positive way, versus the other model, which is the authoritarian model, which they're quite familiar with as well in the Middle East.
Question. You mentioned Jewish origin of President Zelensky, and just a question popped up in my mind. Do you consider this to be a problem or an obstacle in communicating with the regional countries who are Muslim, as we all know, in its majority? Do you think that this is an obstacle that can be aggravated in the context of the Israel and Palestinian conflict happening nowadays?
No, it's not the. I don't think the Jewishness or the Judaism, because you have the region has a very long history with the Jewish people, with Jewish communities within the Muslim majority countries. That was not a very easy as well relationship, but it was a historical fact. And many of these, there was a history of conflict, but there was also a history of cooperation and peaceful coexistence, and actually positive peaceful coexistence for centuries. So it's not that issue. I think the main issue is the political statements sometimes are misunderstood in one way or another. Also, they have here the main. If it's a very sensitive topic, so if the communication are perceived as double standard or as upholding a double standard, meaning that you would at one point you would be fighting a war of independence against occupation, but at the same time you don't say much about the occupation of other territories, then this will be seen as we will not perceive in a positive way. That's on one end, but also on the other end, people here the term. Obviously, Zionism is a whole. It's a political ideology. You will have the founders, some of the founders of Zionism were Jews, but they also abandoned Zionism, changed their minds at one point, including the founder, Herzl. But also you have the people who are Zionism, the Zionists, the founder of Israel, who did not really were atheists, right? They did not believe in God. So the complete, like, Zionism is not equivalent to Judaism. This is or the Jewish religion. This is what I'm trying to say. But also within Zionism, you have like multiple strands. You have the political, revolutionary, revisionists. So there's a whole story. So here, these dynamics are blurred. So sometimes you need to explain a lot and to sit and perhaps take a course in the class to try to distinguish between all of this. What religion? So there's Islam and Islamism, right? Islamism is a political ideology, 1970s or maybe 1940s, depending on where you draw the line. 20th century political ideology that used some texts from Islam and then turned it into a vision. It's all human agency. There's nothing holy about it. It is intellectuals and figures and political figures and activists from the 20th century who decided to create an ideology. Zionism and Judaism, you have or similar. You have the religion and then you have the political ideology, and even the political ideology has its own factions and ideological strands, and this needs to be understood to make the difference. But back to your question, no, it's not being Jewish, of course, but it's just the political statements that may be associated with double standards.
Yeah, because it seems to be a little bit of a problem nowadays for Ukraine to promote its interest in the so-called global South countries, as in Asia, for example, in Latin America as well, and in the Middle East also, due to many different reasons. So that's just the question that popped in my mind, because in Asia, when you try to rely on democratic values and democratic rhetorics, human rights protection, and things like that, this kind of rhetoric does not actually work well in these countries, as well as I believe in Middle Eastern, due to its specific, like historical specific, political specific, which is absolutely acceptable because, you know, there are many different countries in the world. They're all different and have its own specific features, which we have to take into account. And also, I want to go back a little bit to the dichotomy that you mentioned, the dichotomy between democratic and authoritarian. How do the countries of the Middle East assess Iran and its cooperation with Russia? Because definitely their bilateral relations, their trade and all the benefits that Iran gets from trade with Russia, from trading weaponry with Russia, it has its own implications for regional dynamics as well, because both countries share strategic interests. They face common adversaries, the United States namely. So what can be actually done like from the Middle Eastern countries that can confine Iran's cooperation with Russia? And is it actually, do the Middle Eastern countries actually assess Iranian and Russian relations as a problem to the region or globally?
They do. It's so this is a third, or actually, how many lenses did we speak about now? About 4, or maybe this is the 5th one. The Iranian-Saudi rivalry, if you wish, in the region. These are two rising powers. Iran's frame itself as the leader of what it calls the axis of resistance. And resistance to what? It's resistance mainly to Western influence in the region, but resistance also to what they call colonialism, etc. And this is a coalition of primarily a state actor, which is Iran, but also sub-state actors, so organizations that have a veto over the state. You know, in a way that they don't rule, so they're not accountable, they're not government, they're not elected, but they have veto matters over national security issues, over military and defense affairs. They have their own foreign policy and so on. So the prime example of this is Hezbollah, a Lebanese armed organization that has partial representation in the parliament, and has also various other civilian activities, but it's a force to be reckoned with. Somewhere between 50,000 active or regulars, and another 50,000 reserves, plus rocket artillery, plus other combat branches that are quite established. And Iran played that model multiple times. Now we see it as well in Yemen with Ansarullah, the Houthis. So a non-state force with significant ballistic and cruise and loitering munition capabilities, but also in places like Iraq with the battalions, Hezbollah battalions, Kataib Hezbollah, who are also another armed organizations, but also there are others as well. So that model on one end is very close to Russia in terms of the support, in terms of the high-level coordination in the case of Syria specifically, and they actually kept the regime, kept a very weak regime of Bashar that was about to collapse in 2015. But with the Russian intervention from the air and brigade-sized mix of infantry and naval infantry, air defense, and other aspects, brigade-sized formation, I mean, add to it a lot of Iranian-supported and Iranian-financed militias with leadership from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard managed to keep the regime, managed to in a way partly win in Syria, not totally win, but partly win in Syria, and keep the regime at least in some of the urban centers, in the big ones. Versus the other end, the Saudis. And their allies that they don't want to see that Iranian influence surrounding them in one way, and therefore wants to undermine that influence by any means, including trying to place this wedge between the Iranians and the Russians and separate their geostrategic aims in a way. I'm not sure they will be that successful. Iran has been playing quite a long game, although we see holes in that game. So the most recent hole is that most of the equipment advertised, like some of the Russian equipment, is not accurate. It's not accurate, and it's quite susceptible to countermeasures. So when you send 330 airborne munitions, 170 loitering munitions, suicide drones, 120 ballistics, and over 20 crews, and then about somewhere between 7 and 14 only land and make it through the air defenses, while regional allies, including the US, the UK, some Arab countries, air defending Israel, then your coalition on one end doesn't look good. And also, if you're trying to send a strategic signal that your weapons, long-range weapons, are effective, that doesn't look good as well. So they have as well some holes in their game. But there, if we looked at the controlling multiple Arab capitals in Sana'a, Yemen, Beirut, Lebanon, Baghdad, Iraq, Damascus, Syria, without taking responsibility of the government, without being accountable to the people, taking it via sub-state actors, sub-state armed actors, militias. Very well, actually, the militias doesn't describe the military capabilities of some of these groups, but taking control via exerting this influence is a very effective way. So it's a very similar way to the LNR and the DNR in the case of, except that the LNR and the DNR actually separated pieces of the country and wanted to, it's an irredentist project, right? They wanted to join the Russian Federation, but Russia invested in them to regain it was a Russian-led operation, basically, from 2014. So actually, in a way, the Russians are following the Iranian model and learning. And I at one point, it was notes taken from the Middle East, I think, both from the case of ISIS, which is another story, but also from the case of how to exert influence via a series of sub-state actors with very strong military capabilities, and therefore undermine your enemy in an irregular warfare strategy.
So you mentioned that Russia is learning from Iran, and you mentioned also ISIS. So let's go a little bit deeper into your research, your book that you've published, How ISIS Fights Military Tactics in Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Egypt, which was presented, as far as I understand, not long ago in Ukraine as well, and was published in the Ukrainian language. So you compare Russian tactics in Ukraine. You were stating that Russian tactics in Ukraine resemble terrorist extremist strategies, ISIS in particular. So could you please elaborate a little bit on what resemblance do you see?
So the story goes back to Ukraine in 2016. I was doing this project on how the smaller side, the weaker side, state or non-state, fights back. And part of the project is I wanted to understand how Ukrainians fought back, especially in the very, very first counteroffensive. People, they forget that the first counteroffensive happened in the summer of 2014. You took back the Slovyansk, Kramatorsk, Mariupol, and other areas, other towns and regions. So I was, in 2016, trying to understand, how Crimea happened, and also the summer counteroffensive of 2014. I was talking to some of the soldiers who served in Crimea, and they were describing what happened in Crimea. And I was thinking, this is what they're telling me is the exact. I heard that story before. That's the exact story of how ISIS, the terrorist organization, Islamic State of Iraq and Sham, now IS, had taken the city of Raqqa in September 2013. Was that series of false front civilian organizations, a series of infiltrations of the security and the military structures. In the case of Raqqa, it was for the rebels. In the case of Crimea, it was for the official security establishment. The series of propaganda, psychological, and information operations to misinform and recruit as much as possible from the public to your side. And then a series of assassinations, kidnappings, destabilization operations that kept on occurring to more or less create this societal frictions and society and discohesion, social discohesion. And then when you destabilize as much, you just use the force to secure the victory, because you already got the victory. The situation is already collapsing to your benefit, and then you just secure the force, secure the victory with a conventional force. And ISIS did not have the large amphibious landing or air assault operations that happened in Crimea, one of the largest in the history of Eastern Europe since 1945. But they had mainly technicals, and technicals are civilian pickup trucks with heavy machine guns on them. So they give you kind of mobility and firepower, but they don't give you enough protection. So you have, they did that in Raqqa in 2013, and the Russians did a similar case with securing the victory in Crimea after that stabilization, intense hybrid warfare operation, ISIS style, in Crimea in January, and then by March, they annexed the most important geostrategic region, perhaps in the south of Ukraine, with almost no costs. It was a cost of one militiaman. That's about it. You want to compare it to the conventional. When they fight, their casualties now, according to the UK military intelligence recent report, north of 415,000 between death and wounded. So casualties. Well, death, wounded, POWs, and missing and defected. So north of 415,000 are the Russian casualties versus one in the case of Crimea. But it's not just that. Then you have the beheadings that happened. You have the intense usage of IEDs, of improvised explosive devices, in areas that have no military value. Why would you leave over 18,000, according to the Ukrainian Emergency Service, over 18,000 IEDs, ordnance, unexploded bombs, in places like children parks, people's homes, just in Kyiv Oblast, just to do damage. So you're covering your retreat by planting all these IEDs to make sure that inflict as much damage as possible, and to make sure that you're not followed. Very ISIS thing to do. They pretty much did the same thing in at least the 4 countries that I delved deep in the study of how the ISIS fights there: Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Egypt. But then you have the weaponization of sexual violence and rape, which is also a very ISIS-style way of warfare, which has happened, as we know, in Kyiv Oblast, Chernihiv Oblast. Now we're discovering more in Kherson, and definitely we'll know more when Mariupol and areas of Donetsk and Luhansk will be liberated. So we have. So if you put this picture together, this is a way of warfare, basically, way of warfare that is designed to destabilize the enemy as fast as possible with measures that will be criminal, would constitute war crimes, but they're cheap and they're effective. And once you destabilize enough and you inflict enough terror, whether by psychological operations, information operations, sexual violence, IED warfare, kidnapping, assassinations, and then also trick the public via false flag organizations, civilian organizations, and militias, and so on. Then you secure this by victory. So this is a way of warfare that is hybrid, that is effective, but also it commits a series of war crimes, and it's definitely.
Yeah, I see it now way more clearly. We do understand that Russia is a terrorist state, and there is even a hashtag in the social media, Russia is a terrorist state. But the comparison itself to ISIS, I find it quite interesting because I have never actually thought about it before. Thank you very much, Dr. Omar Ashour, for this insightful and valuable discussion. I believe that now our audience understands the developments in the Middle Eastern region way better. Well, I certainly do now. Thank you very, very much for finding time to talk to us and Talking Substance.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Alina, for having me. And Slava Ukraini.
Yeah. Slava. This was Talking Substance. Thank you very much for staying with us in this episode. Please do not forget to like, subscribe, and comment on this episode.